Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever official episode of the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings. I'm joined today with my co-host Jason. First, I want to thank everyone for listening. It means a lot to us that you would give us a chance, and we hope that you enjoy the show and continue to listen to us in the future. Before we get going, I want to give everyone, an idea of what the show is going to be like. The goal that Jason and I have for the show is to have in-depth, lengthy discussions about current themes and trends within the wrestling industry. What what we are trying to do is to avoid kind of giving out hot takes or instant reactions to shows that we just watched or breaking news that we just found out about. What we want to do is to look at news and trends and discuss how that all fits into the broader scope of the professional wrestling industry. That is where the name Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast comes from, is we're looking to have a more serious discussion about the industry in general and not just kind of give out all these hot takes and opinions that I personally enjoy a lot when I hear other people give them, but we want to kind of give you guys something different. Jason and I both cover the professional wrestling industry and have written numerous pieces for different websites. We're going to be discussing, like I said, themes and trends from across the wrestling world. Obviously, I think we're going to have more of a focus on WWE and AEW just because I think they're the most popular wrestling organizations out there. In today's episode, we're mostly going to be about WWE, but we're also going to work in discussions about New Japan Pro Wrestling, Ring of Honor, Impact, smaller independent promotions from around the world, or just broad wrestling topics in general that aren't specifically tied down to one promotion. On some episodes, we might discuss 4 or 5 topics. On other episodes, we might only do 1 or 2. The conversations and the trends we notice going on in the industry will dictate all of that. Jason, do you have anything you want to add?
No, just like you said, we're trying to get some more in-depth conversations, other than just hot takey, YouTube gifs coming out.
Yeah.
You always see these viral videos coming out, people ranting and raging about WWE. We're not trying to be that way. Obviously, we'll have our own rants, but we'll try to add some substance to those and give our reasonings why we dislike the things that are going on in wrestling, or we like them as well.
Yeah, I don't think we're trying to look at things like in a vacuum or just instantly react to something, because what I think ends up happening in almost everything, but wrestling in particular, is that we'll see something, we'll watch something, we'll hear something, and we'll have an immediate reaction to it. But in reality, obviously our opinion changes a lot as the weeks go by, as we see stories develop, as we see the kind of impact what really ends up happening on the industry. So I think what I kind of pitched to Jason originally when we were talking about this was kind of a macro discussion about the pro wrestling industry, not focusing on one specific tiny moment or story, but rather a general broad aspect of wrestling. Um, so today's topic we want to talk about is we're going to talk about WWE storytelling and how WWE's current formula for storytelling and character development impacts the company. Storytelling is the pillar of professional wrestling. While we all enjoy watching wrestling matches that are filled with action and entertaining promos and fun characters, at the end of the day, I think wrestling fans, the reason we're watching weekly television programming is because we want to see stories develop. We want to become engaged in a story so that when we're watching matches, we feel like the consequences of the match actually matter. When we watch a promo, we want to feel that they're telling a story, not that they just have a fun catchphrase. And I think so. Kind of to jump off on that, something that has occurred to me while watching WWE over the past few years is how the company has become, I don't want to say less reliant on storytelling, but it seems like a lot of the time when I watch a WWE pay per view, I end up seeing a lot of matches that I think like, oh, that will be a good match because these are two good workers. But I rarely find myself being like, I want to see where this storyline is going. And that's kind of atypical, I think, of people's perception of WWE, both currently and definitely historically, where WWE was a promotion that was about storylines and characters. It wasn't a wrestling, like an in ring action promotion necessarily. I mean, the rise of independent promotions and the rise of like New Japan Pro Wrestling becoming more popular in the US and to an extent AEW, although we'll probably touch on AEW a little bit later when comparing them to WWE. But kind of alternative wrestling promotions rose up because I think people were like, oh, the wrestling in WWE is bad. It's just, it's John Cena doing his 5 moves of doom. It's, you know what I mean? And But now it's almost like WWE is almost like Pro Wrestling Guerrilla or AAW or Warrior Wrestling or one of these kind of super indie promotions that
Sure.
will put together like a card with, because they're only running like once every 2 months or whatever, they're not like
Hmm.
necessarily full of storyline, but you just kind of look at it and you'd be like, oh, I don't know. Brian Cage is wrestling, Brian Pillman Jr. That looks good. Like, you don't think about it like that. And I feel like a lot of times that I find watching WWE to be like that, which is not how it's always been. And I think is something that I think a lot of people still kind of overlook in the sense that even like the NXT show from Sunday, which I enjoyed. I thought it was very entertaining. I thought the matches were all good. But I also saw it as like there's not a lot of storylines going on. There's not a lot of like I like the matches. I like Gargano versus Priest. I like
Yeah.
Swerve Scott versus Phantasma. I can't not remember Phantasma's name in WWE.
Legado or something.
Yeah, Legado del Fantasma. Well, that's the name of the stable. Um,
All right. Yeah.
but I really like the matches, but I don't find myself like enthralled in the storylines or really caring who wins or who loses. And that I think has become a consistent problem for WWE. Um, I don't know, Jason. What do you think about that? As far as just like the bigger shows having very little like storyline aspects to the matches, especially outside of like the main event.
Yeah, definitely. I think you especially see it. Like Ring of Honor was like the hot promotion for the indies for a very long time, like mid 2000s and into the sort of early 2010s until NXT and WWE started, um, you know, uh, poaching all of Ring of Honor's talent. Get Kevin Steen, El Generico, eventually Adam Cole eventually joined NXT, and so sort of see even all the other guys, the independents, Johnny Gargano, Ciampa, these guys were poached from the indies because they were rightfully very popular wrestlers. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's, Triple H was like, hey, I want that guy, I want him. And so, they rightfully signed them because they were wrestlers. And we do see that now. But eventually you have all these guys that come in for one promotion or just all the guys that come in from the indies that are used to this indie style. And so that's going to permeate throughout the company. And obviously, there's other factors. Vince McMahon is obvious. I doubt he's actually watching all these indie promotions. Triple H probably is. And so that's why it's permeated through NXT. But then eventually, these NXT guys get called up and, they influence the style. We see now that there's not that many veterans on the classic veterans from like the Attitude Era or even from the Ruthless Aggression era. Randy Orton, he's pretty much the main like old guy that's sort of still in the main event scene. Rey Mysterio is still around, but he's kind of putting over his son and Dominic, and pretty much that's really it from that past era. That's really sort of pushing that old WWE style of storytelling, and not really just selling. Well, just even selling in general. Obviously, Edge was around for a bit, and he and Randy Orton told some really good stories in the ring. With some hits and misses here and there, but it's just natural, especially for Edge coming back. But definitely, yeah, like most of the guys, all the top guys today, with the exception of a few here and there, are the indie guys. Just look at NXT. Finn Balor coming from New Japan, Kyle O'Reilly, big Ring of Honor guy himself, and Adam Cole. He's seen as a top guy in some sort of ways. There's some rumors about him moving up to the main roster, and that's really what's permeating throughout the storytelling of WWE. Is that's why all the big moves are being sold, because that's the indie style of wrestling, and that's become mainstream wrestling. It's no longer niche anymore. This style of wrestling is the standard, and if you're not up to that standard, you're probably not going to get signed, or at least if you don't fit in these other checklists that these big companies have, you're probably not going to get signed.
Yeah, I want to I think there's kind of a divide in thinking when it comes to how WWE has changed. I think some people are kind of reactive to how WWE's in-ring product has changed and the impact that it has had on the storytelling aspects. As you touched on, Jason, the in-ring standard for WWE has increased a lot over the last 10 years. And it's very good for the viewer because if you go back and watch the Attitude Era, if you go back and watch, the Hulkamania era, or any era basically before 2002, I use the Ruthless Aggression era as a benchmark, but even then, since then, the average match has improved a lot. Like the undercard and stuff, those matches are really bad. There are a lot of people who are getting pushed. There are a lot of people who are having like 4-minute matches that are just really bad. And you don't have that. You don't have that anymore. Like even if you go back, I know it's just Dave Meltzer's opinion, but if you go back and look at like the old Observer ratings for like SummerSlam 1992, like you'll see like negative star matches and just like these matches that were like extremely bad, far worse than what you would normally see today. So the in-ring has improved, but I don't see that as directly related to a lack of storytelling. What I think it ends up happening is that because WWE's storytelling vehicle is ineffective, it's broken. The formula doesn't work the way it used to, and we're going to get into that later. But I think because of that, what ends up happening is that all of these matches, all they have is the in-ring action. The only saving grace for for a lot of these pay-per-views are that the matches are generally good. I think that's different. I think it's different to say that than to say that like, oh, they don't care about storytelling. They only care about having good matches. Because I don't think I've ever heard a professional wrestler actually say that. I don't think I've ever heard a pundit or a fan actually say that, like, I don't care about storytelling. I just want to see cool moves. Like, I think all serious wrestling fans, like I said, storytelling is the pillar of professional wrestling. We want to see stories. I think it's great that the in-ring product has improved so much. I'll tell you what, if WWE's storytelling if WWE's in-ring product was back where it was 20 or 30 years ago, and the storytelling was this bad, the show would be like so much worse than it really was. But I don't think there's a correlation directly between storytelling and like in-ring action. What I end up seeing happening is that I think people, because in-ring action is sometimes the only saving grace on a lot of these shows, it kind of stands out being like, well, the in-ring's good, but I don't care because the storytelling's bad. So therefore, it's this mentality that in-ring is important and storytelling isn't. I don't think any wrestler actually thinks that, or any wrestler in WWE actually thinks that. I just think it's the reality of WWE's inability to tell stories and create storylines that people really relate to on a regular basis. There are some good storylines in that company.
Yeah, and I would also say this is also pre-pandemic as well. This is like not a result
Yes.
of the pandemic. I think we were seeing this before the pandemic as well, that, WWE, they are very reactionary towards a lot of things. They, as like even look at some popular wrestlers like Rusev, for example. He's a recent example. He's a guy that got over with the crowd, but nothing was really done with him. His only saving grace was he had good matches. He looked good in the ring, but other than that, nothing was really built for him. You see that for a lot of guys, a lot of guys who left WWE, who one of their main reasons for leaving was because they weren't doing anything with me. And these were guys who are capable of having good matches. Look at Mike Bennett recently at Warrior Wrestling. He had a really good match against Cheeseburger, and we didn't really see that a lot. He had the potential of doing that,
Yeah,
but he just
if
yeah, go ahead.
WWE only cared about like if there was a mentality, it's like we just got to have good matches. They wouldn't have screwed up Ricochet. They wouldn't have screwed up Chad Gable. They wouldn't have screwed up a bunch of these guys from NXT that would go out and have great matches. They wouldn't have screwed up the Revival. You
Yeah.
know, there are plenty of things that's like, you know, WWE picks and chooses who they want to push. And I honestly think that like being really good in the ring is very high up on those priority list. I think they care about what you look like. I think they care about your charisma. And I think they care about how you can talk. And I think they care about how marketable you are. And those are all valuable things. Those aren't things that you shouldn't look at. But again, a counterpoint to, I don't think there's a mentality in WWE to be like, we really got to focus on the in-ring. It's got to be great. I think that because their storylines and storytelling is kind of broken, that the fallout is that the matches end up being basically the only good things on a lot of these shows.
Yeah, definitely. You even see with mainstream coverage as well. Like even like when ESPN talks about wrestling once in a while, they aren't really talking about the in-ring product in terms of wrestling. They kind of just talk about storylines and what's going on. They're not asking Triple H of like, oh, what'd you think about this guy? And like, how do you think he performs in the ring? No, they're just talking about the story that guy's in. Or if Charlotte's, doing a media piece, they're asking her about the stories that she's in. They're not asking her, oh, what about the intricacies of your figure four, your
Yeah.
figure eight? They don't really care about that.
Yeah, like
And like you said, it's understandable why they do this, about why they care about the aesthetics, because that's what WWE's been about since the 80s. They're all about aesthetics. But obviously, yeah, things have changed recently from 40 years ago, obviously, for obvious reasons.
mhm. Yeah, and so something I wanted to touch on, kind of one of like the first kind of topics related to this, is the length of storylines and the lengths of storytelling, and how that ties into this other thing that WWE has, which is an incredible amount. So WWE has an incredible amount of television time that it has to fill each week. 3 hours of Raw, 2 hours of NXT, 2 hours of SmackDown, and then obviously you have things like Main Event and 205 Live, which nobody really
Yeah.
watches. So we're not really going to talk.
NXT UK.
Yeah, NXT UK. I mean, they have a ton of TV time to fill up. You have 3 hours of Raw each week, and on top of that, currently you have segregated rosters for each of those brands. So you're dealing with this kind of a set amount of people per show, and this will be a theme that we'll talk about on this show until the end of time. WWE's business is totally reliant on the television contracts and how much money they get from television. So they have to have that 3rd hour Raw. They're not going to get rid of the 3rd hour Raw. Or anything like that because they want to improve the quality of the show. All the money comes from filling up TV time. When WWE signed the new TV contracts, one of the smartest analysis I've heard about it was that WWE is not a wrestling company. It is a television company. It is producing television content. That is the number one goal. And so what ends up happening is that, and we've seen this a lot on Raw, I think the two obvious examples are the feud between Andrade and Angel Garza and the Street Profits, and then the feud between loosely Rey Mysterio and Seth Rollins, with a bunch of other characters coming in and out of it, where they have a match almost every week, over and over and over again. Apollo Crews and Ricochet versus the Hurt Business is another one of those. There's 3 feuds right on Raw, and they just have matches over and over and over again. Now, some people will say, I want WWE to have long-term storylines, and certainly those are long-term storylines. They've been happening for months, but they're not very good, and they're pretty boring. And that even though like they've been feuding forever, I don't think when Apollo Crews wrestled Bobby Lashley for the U.S. Championship at Clash of Champions, I don't think people are like, yes, I'm really here because the storyline has been so good. It's been basically like, I hope these guys have a good match because I don't really care at all about the storyline that's gone into this. And those guys have been feuding for months. And so I think that there's kind of a push and pull dynamic where I think people say they want long storylines. I personally don't want. I don't say I don't want long storylines. I want good storylines. Fans want good storylines. And I don't think there's a rule of thumb that a storyline has to be, this amount of weeks long, and it's got to include this amount of many matches, and it's got to have like this, and that. I don't think there's any hard and fast rules for what makes a good storyline, just like I don't think there's any hard or fast rules for what makes a good wrestling match or a good promo or anything like that. Anything can be done well if it's done in a way that is entertaining to fans. And so I think that some people get tied down with like, oh, you say you want long-term storytelling and they give it to you and then you don't like it. And it's like, no, I don't think anyone really wants long-term storylines for the sake of it being long-term. I think they just want it to be good.
Yeah, definitely. Even I think Roman Reigns was kind of sort of harping back on fans on Twitter about that, of like,
Yeah,
oh,
oh
I'm
my God,
making filet mignon.
don't get me started on the wrestlers in WWE who get mad at the fans who don't like the product. I understand it. Social media is a tough environment for a celebrity. It's a tough environment for pretty much everyone. I'm sure they feel like they get a ton of unjustified criticism, and they definitely do. I don't care who you are. If you're a famous person on social media, you're going to get some criticism that's justified, but you're also going to get a lot of it where people are just trolling you or people hate you because they're aligned with someone else or anything like that. So I get it, but you're right about like, there's a defensiveness to it. And like I said, nobody cares about storylines that last for like 8 months if they're not good. They actually become quite torturous. I mean, I remember I one time a fairly of an Impact Wrestling.
Yeah.
And the Aces and Eights storyline started. And that storyline went on for like 8 or 9 months. And for the first like 6 months, there was very little storyline development. We found out very little about who was in the group. I think, I want to say, I might have this wrong. People will clap back at me if I do. But I think it was like the storyline started in like May of one year. And we didn't find out Bully Ray was the leader until like January. And if you were telling a long-term story, that would be okay. But the storyline was pretty redundant. It was like each week guys come out, they beat up people, they wear masks, we don't know who they are. And that like just went on and on and on and on. And it was very boring. And it totally knocked me out of Impact. I didn't want to watch the show anymore. I was already kind of teetering on the edge because of the changes that had been brought in when Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan were hired. But and I was like, I'm done. I don't care that like the storyline's gone on way too long. And that's just one example, a personal example of like a storyline that's long, but I don't think it was very good. And I think that becomes a key factor in this, that you can't just have a long storyline and fans will react to it, because if it's not entertaining week to week and it just feels like redundant, fans are just going to tune out and they're going to be like, okay, this is just another thing I don't need to watch or pay attention to because I know where this goes because I've seen the same thing happen every week.
Yeah. I think another thing too, I don't know if Eric Bischoff has ever said whether he knew Bully Ray was going to be the leader or not, whether that was a plan the whole time. But I think the big thing is that a plan, you need a plan to figure out, you want to get to point A to point B. So again, I don't know if Bischoff has ever said on his podcast whether he knew the intricacies of the storyline going out. But you look at something like the anonymous Raw GM.
Another good example.
It was very clear in the first couple of weeks that WWE had no idea who the anonymous Raw GM was going to be. There were many rumors, many reports going on at the time. Very good reporting. I'm not discounting that people who reported, this is the person. I'm sure that's who they considered. But I think at the end of the day, they had no idea who it was, and they eventually just dropped the story in line. They made it a joke. I think even a year or two later, that was Hornswoggle, and so they just made a big joke out of it because they had no idea who it was. And I think that's the big thing for a lot of fans is that they see a storyline come up and they groan not because they think it's going to be bad right away. They just groan because they know that there's no plan going into this, especially with these mystery angles that WWE has been in love with for a very long time. You can even go back to the Attitude Era. People like to look back in the Attitude Era like it was great, but with the whole
the higher power,
it was me Austin
yeah
thing. Obviously there were many rumors that Christopher Daniels was going to be that, or Sting or Jake Roberts, but it's a very memeable moment, but it was bad storytelling. The story made no sense.
People remember the meme though, like they was like, oh yeah, it was me Austin, that was great, and it's like if you're at the time like, no, this sucked. And I agree with you, Jason, that WWE fans didn't start watching the product and develop a cynicism about the long-term storytelling. It's something that's been taught to them, and it ends up hurting. It's now at the point where it hurts angles, where if you see a WWE shooting a big angle, some fans, I would say I'm probably included in this, are like, okay, that angle was good, but I'm not getting on board with this thing because I have seen this story before, and I am not ready to invest that much in this angle because I don't think that I think WWE is gonna drop the ball somewhere. I think, the Nexus angle is a good example of that. It's an angle that really taught fans to not get that invested in things because WWE, whether they're gonna just completely, they don't have a plan or the plan is bad. Either way,
the plan was changed.
Yeah, I mean, anyone. Yeah, like I said, we both cover pro wrestling. If you cover pro wrestling, you understand that Vince McMahon changes his mind a lot, and that they don't always have the best kind of development and plans for things going forward because it changes so much, and they change who they want to push, and they change the way they want angles to go, and sometimes they just kill angles off, or they just disappear from TV, and we never see them ever again. So I think that's part of it, and then kind of related to the length of storytelling department is, I think, complexity of storylines. That's another thing I hear a lot of people say. I want complex storylines. I want storylines that involve a lot of nuance, a lot of callbacks to previous things. I want that kind of storytelling. Similar to people who say they want long-term storytelling. I want complex storytelling. I feel kind of differently about this. I think that for professional wrestling, which is entertaining, but at the end of the day is not a particularly good medium for complex storytelling as compared to like a book or a movie or a comic book series, um, or anything like that. I actually think that simple storylines are the way to go. I'll use an example right now. The Roman Reigns versus Jey Uso story is very simple. It's Roman Reigns was a good guy. He's kind of paranoid. He's become much more aggressive. He turned heel. His good guy buddy cousin, Jey Uso, who he has a long history with that's been frequently acknowledged on WWE programming, is like, hey man, like what's going on? And Roman, because he's paranoid, it says, oh, you want to challenge me? I'm going to kick your ass. That's a very simple storyline. I just explained it in 5 sentences. And I think that any wrestling fan who doesn't watch WWE on a weekly basis, who might just watch the pay-per-views, who might just watch 1 or 2 shows a year, can see that match and like, oh, I understand this, and it's good. It's probably the most universally praised storyline the company has done probably in a year. Um, and it's very simple. It's not complex. And I do think that when it comes to pro wrestling, I think people get too hung up in this like hardcore idolization of like, I want this unbelievably meaningful storyline, this moving storyline that contains all this nuance and rewards me for having watched for so long and so diligently. I think that as a general rule in pro wrestling, the simple stuff works the best because it's so easy to relate to the fans, and it's easy to relate that kind of angle on television where it's just like I said, it's not like you're basically hoping to tell stories through guys cutting promos and guys having matches. So you're trying to tell a story through the idea of like fall athletic competition. And it's easy to do that when the angle is, you know, I'm the head of my family and this guy's trying to challenge me, I'm gonna beat him down, than it is to like whatever's happening with the Fiend and Alexa Bliss.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, how um, indie wrestling has sort of become was sort of permeated WWE with all the indie guys, and I think that's difficult to do with WWE because they don't really acknowledge any other wrestling company. So you can't really
Yep.
call back to Ring of Honor and say they tried to do it with Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn. That worked out really well because those guys are great performers. But in general, I don't think it's going to work really well if you have to call back to New Japan or PWG or Ring of Honor. It kind of goes back to I think the complex storylines with the nuances, that's stuff you see in All Japan in the 90s. And that's sort of, PWG, obviously Excalibur and all those guys, they're inspired for that kind of wrestling over there. And so PWG kind of does that where, they run shows like quarterly. They run shows like monthly or whatever. And there's callbacks to every other show with the Young Bucks doing their thing or, Kevin Steen being champion as well. And so that works there in the indie scene because that's a very passionate fan base. Like you said before, WWE is a television company. And so you can't expect people to follow everything all the time. It's like when a movie is based on a book, you don't expect people to read the book beforehand. You
Yeah.
have to present things as fresh and new. You can't expect people to understand Adam Cole's history in Ring of Honor or Finn Balor's past history of Bullet Club or Prince Devitt. They're telling different stories because they're attracting different audiences.
Yeah, I mean, even something like Sasha versus Bailey, which has been a very good feud, that's obviously something that's taken years to develop. That is a long storyline. And you can argue that it's a complex storyline. Part of the reason it's complex is because WWE's like started doing the turn, then changed plans, then like that's part of the reason why it's so complex. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it's still very simple. It's these people were best friends. They worked really hard together. One of them got paranoid because they were the champion, and she ended up turning on her. So now you have a babyface and heel dynamic. That's really simple. And yes, it's long, and yes, it does kind of reward the viewer for having watched WWE programming for the last several years to see to understand their rivalry. But if you're turning on the WWE network and you got a friend over or someone who's watching it and it's like, yeah, I don't really, follow WWE that closely. What's going on? You can just be like, oh, they're best friends now. They're feeling like it's very simple. And even like when you said like stuff like PWG and New Japan may be a little bit different because their storytelling is very different, but even PWG, like, it wasn't like the storytelling was like this amazingly long, like incredible installments of television. It was mostly just like, oh, there was this angle that they did at the end of the last show, like, Kevin Steen ran out and hit this guy with his move, and the next week he's got a championship match. Like, very simple kind of stuff.
Sure.
And I always think that, I think when people talk about how, oh, this is going to be complex and I want this to be very like astute, like, let me ask you, what did you think of the Bray Wyatt, Bray Wyatt or the Fiend John Cena match at WrestleMania, the Firefly Funhouse match? Like, what was your reaction to that?
Definitely felt like an acid trip, even though I do not do drugs. But yeah, I was just very indifferent on it. I just didn't really care for it. Even the cinematic matches in general, I just didn't really care for it. To be honest, I get what the story they're trying to tell. I can tell that John Cena, Bray Wyatt, they were really collaborating. They were really filling up the creative juices, so to speak. They really wanted to do something with this match, want to do something unique, which they definitely did something unique. It just wasn't for me personally. I don't know what you thought about the match.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, indifferent is a good term, but there are people out there who absolutely loved the match, and they thought that there was great elements to it. Bray Wyatt singing like Nikki Bella's theme song to John Cena, and obviously, if you're a hardcore WWE fan, you know that John Cena dated Nikki Bella and they were engaged, but then the wedding broke off. Blah blah blah. All this stuff happened. But like the average fans, like the casual fan who's watching WrestleMania isn't going to know that. And they're not going to understand a lot of the things that were happening in it. And they wouldn't even, I mean, I didn't really understand what was happening in it. And I do this for a living. So, like to me, like, and I heard someone say that, like, oh, this is going to, like, I think bring casual fans back to the product. And I could not disagree with that more. I think that kind of stuff, while entertaining to like hardcore fans that are really in there, I just don't know how you can do that and expect like people who aren't super hardcore fans to keep up and to understand it, because the match is it's such a different concept. And I think like you can do that, like, if you have a hardcore base, but for a lot of the casual fans, I don't know what that's doing for them. I think they're thinking like, what is this? Like, I don't care about this at all. Like, I mean, I tried explaining the what was it? I can't even remember. Was it called the swamp match? The swamp fight?
Yeah, swamp fight.
It was called, yeah. I remember like after that show, Extreme Rules, and like I remember I like was talking to my dad, who's not a wrestling fan, about it, and I was like trying to explain to him why it was so bad, and I just basically said like, it's just not wrestling. Like, it's like Bray Wyatt trying to drown Braun Strowman. He's trying to scare him with a python. Like, it's just like, it's not pro wrestling. Roman Reigns versus Jey Uso, that's pro wrestling. Bayley versus Sasha, that's pro wrestling. That kind of stuff, it's just not pro wrestling to me. And I think, while very complex, and like, oh, full of callbacks that might pop a certain segment of the fan base, I just don't see like how that is like really a positive for WWE, whether building their audience or even maintaining some of their current audience, because I think it's a turnoff to a lot of fans who expect pro wrestling to be pro wrestling in some way, shape, or form. And I'm not saying that you can't have different versions of pro wrestling, but I do think that you do kind of have to keep it on the level, and I think that happens a lot with WWE.
Yeah, I think definitely a distinction is that it's not WWE wrestling, because I think so. Like Final Deletion is really fun, and it does appeal to hardcore fans, but that's sort of the point. And it also, with Matt Hardy, he kind of takes it seriously, but at the same time he doesn't really take it that seriously as well. I think the problem with WWE is that they take these things very seriously, and I think that's the disconnect there. Like,
there's no wink.
Something like this, yeah, exactly, because there is a lot of tongue in cheek and winking with stuff the Young Bucks do with being the elite, with Matt Hardy and his broken universe. With WWE, with the Fiend, they want you to take this seriously, and obviously no one's really taking this seriously. I mean, some people are, obviously there's a lot of fans of the Fiend, but there's no real nuance to it. There's no, wink wink or tongue in cheek sort of things. I think that's the distinction there. It's not WWE wrestling, but I think this can be pro wrestling. It's just you just don't take it too seriously. That's the big distinction there, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's, and I'm not a fan of the broken Matt Hardy stuff that much. Like I don't like when
Yeah,
it's
I'm
on,
not either.
when it was on Dynamite, when it was on the pay-per-view, it's okay for like a quick second, but I don't want to see like a whole angle built around it. I mean,
Mhm.
the Fiend at for a time, probably not anymore with Reigns coming back, was the Fiend was the most pushed person on WWE television, or the most pushed
Yeah.
person on SmackDown. And they were the world champion. It was pushed very seriously as a very serious thing. And like when Braun Strowman was sucked into like a swamp and never presumably drowned or eaten by an alligator, they cut back, or any wacky Fiend thing happens, the announcers come back and it was very disturbing. Like like it's presented as being very serious on television, on as like a product on television. And I do think I agree with you that is a disconnect where I think most people, even people who enjoy it, are enjoying it because it's so goofy and absurd and funny. I don't think anyone's like, oh my god, Braun Strowman got eaten by an alligator. I've got to tune into SmackDown. I got to find out. I hope that's not true. Like, like I don't think there's that kind of emotional investment in it the way you might get a thing where it's like, oh, I can't believe Roman Reigns beat the crap out of Jey Uso. Like that was crazy. That was brutal. Like, oh, I wonder how they're going to follow that up. I see one way to do it and another way, and I just disagree with, I guess, the complexity of how far people want to go into these storylines. And I think that's kind of hurt WWE as far as being able to get people over because I just don't see. I think The Fiend appeals to a very limited audience. And I think that ends up hurting, it's going to hurt him in the long run because I think that you can't do that character, um, all the time. You can't have him appearing on talk shows. You can't have him just, featured prominently on SmackDown or Raw every single night without kind of encountering some burnout because at the end of the day, there's not enough versatility there. But I wanted to get away from the Fiend. Another thing that I think hurts WWE storytelling, big time, and it's something that I'm not treading any new ground here, but I do think um, its impact on storyline is different, and that is the just devaluation of the titles.
Sure.
I think that's a major problem for
Yeah.
a lot of these shows because historically in professional wrestling, the world title and any other subsequent titles, the tag titles, mid card titles, they're kind of like how you build storylines around it. You build a storyline around someone feuding over the various championships, and so it's like I don't want to say like I don't want to say it like it's a historical crutch to use the title to set up angles and to have like matches that feel valuable, but it's just like kind of like the founding piece of like a good feud is that they're feuding over the world title or they're feuding over the tag titles or the mid card title, but that title has to have some form of value. Go back to the Intercontinental Championship match at Clash of Champions between Jeff Hardy, AJ Styles, and Sami Zayn. It was a very entertaining match. They did a bunch of crazy stuff on the ladders. They took a lot of risks. It was a
Yep.
good match. Again, from like a ring work perspective, from an in-ring action, it was very good. But I don't care who's the Intercontinental Champion. The title's been devalued a tremendous amount. Even in the weeks leading up to the match, they like passed the title around a few times, and then, their whole angle was that there was two champions, and that when you have two champions, you don't have one. And to me, like that is another example of the storytelling just not being kind of non-existent, and then WWE just hoping that the in-ring action will carry the match. And a lot of people came out of that match and be like, "Yeah, that was great. That's a positive check mark." And I think yes, in a vacuum, that match is entertaining. So therefore, I'm not gonna like you can't criticize it too much. But if you look at it as a whole, it's like okay, these guys all fell off a ladder and they did all this stuff, and it was entertaining at the time, but long term, what is that doing for these characters? Long term, does it matter, that Sami Zayn is the champion? Does it matter that Jeff Hardy lost the championship? Does any of that really matter? And if you can't really come up with a good answer for that, then I think you're putting a cap on how successful, that kind of programming is going to be. Because if people don't really care that much about who wins and who loses, and they're just entertained by the action, I think that puts a pretty significant ceiling on how like invested people are going to become in the product.
Yeah, definitely. If you look at the United States Championship, Bobby Lashley is the United States champion, but like it's kind of just a prop for her business to walk around with.
Yeah.
it's not really the fact that he's the United States champion. It's just the fact that they have something gold to carry around, and obviously the FTR have talked about endlessly about how the tag titles have been devalued, and you can just listen, watch, read their art, read what they have to say, listen to what they have to say. It's obvious that the tag titles have been devalued, especially with them. Um, Flip-flopping the titles, not really caring about who's champion and all that stuff there. And yeah, I kind of agree with you that the fact that no one, it doesn't really matter who's champion, except for Roman Reigns, because he actually cares about the championship. He is, as you said before, the Jey Uso storyline. He's paranoid about, Jey Uso wanting to take his title from him and all that stuff. There, he wants to still maintain his spot, and so that really is compelling. That makes him a compelling Universal Champion. Drew McIntyre is kind of in that similar way. I mean, I think the problem with Drew McIntyre right now is the fact that the championship's been devalued. I think it's the fact that he's been champion for a long time, and it's just really hard to sort of keep up that momentum there. It's another factor that has unrelated to championship devaluation, but still, like you said, with the Intercontinental title, I agree with you that who cares about Jeff Hardy losing the title? I would kind of argue that maybe Sami Zayn, his reaction to winning the title kind of helps a little bit. That's the big thing as well with championships is that, the best way to value a championship is the way the wrestlers and treated that as a miracle to him to win back his Intercontinental Championship. Maybe Jeff Hardy could have sold, losing the titles a bit more. Maybe that would have helped a bit as well. But still, like I said, Roman Reigns, he cares about being Universal Champion. He will do whatever it takes to be Universal Champion and keep that title. And I think that really helps increase the value of the title. Anyone remember when Goldberg was champion? Like, it seems like he didn't really care about being champion. He just wanted to be the top guy in the company again, which resulted in him being champion. And so even Brock Lesnar as well. I think Brock Lesnar being away from the company for a very long time definitely hurts whichever championship he held. And that definitely hurts whoever is getting the rub from him, if they are getting a rub, quote unquote. I don't know if you want to take over from that.
Yeah.
That's what they say with Brock Lesnar.
No, I mean, I think that there's been a lot of reasons that the titles have been diminished. I think I would argue that the U.S. title, the Intercontinental Championship, the tag title, I would argue that those straight up just don't matter. Like, it really doesn't, like, with the exception of it secures, in theory, like that you'll have a match on a pay-per-view. Like, it really doesn't mean anything for you to be a former Intercontinental Champion. It doesn't really mean anything for you to have the title currently, other than that it kind of gives them an excuse to give you a title belt. The world titles still do matter to an extent. I think that they've devalued in a way that to a point currently where they don't have to anymore, where they don't mean as much as they used to. Watching earlier this summer, I did a podcast series kind of watching a bunch of old Saturday night main events, leading up to the most famous episode of the show, which was when Andre the Giant beat Hulk Hogan with the twin ref angle and everything like that. And the importance of the world title just meant so much back then. Hulk Hogan had the championship for, I think, over 3 years, maybe 4. I'll have to get the dates right. But it was just like, yeah, he's just like this eternal champion. And like, for many fans who were getting into the product at that time, Hulk Hogan was the only champion they ever knew. And he just had this championship forever and ever. And when he lost it, it was like the biggest angle you could possibly do in wrestling. It was huge. And that led to that show did a gigantic television viewership. It was just a huge successful thing because obviously you have incredible star power and Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, but it was just the title meant so much at that point. And that's just, over time it's been devalued. But even during the Attitude Era, when you had quick title reigns, it still felt like it meant a lot. Like, it meant a lot when someone won the title. It probably didn't mean as much during the Hulk Hogan age, and certainly not like during like the Bruno Sammartino era. But like, because the way, like, the only thing that really motivated Austin was to win the title and to hold on to it, and the way it was just treated by the talent and how important it always was, it ended up like still feeling really relevant and viable. But over the last few years, I don't think the world title picture has meant as much. I do agree that like the Roman Reigns Jey Uso angle works because if Jey Uso were to beat Roman Reigns for the title, it would be a very big deal. Now, I don't think
Yep.
people really believed that Jey Uso could win that match, but the story around the title is solid in the sense that the world title clearly means a lot to Roman Reigns. And if he were to lose it, it would have a big impact on his character. And so the fans would react to a title match as such. And so that's why I think it really works still, even though I think the title has been kind of devalued in a way. Like, I thought, Lesnar having the title helped from the sense that Lesnar was a big star and that when he did defend the title, it felt like a big deal. But I also thought that it kind of took away from what the world title really means. I wrote about this a few years ago when Roman Reigns was wrestling Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania for the title. And to me, it was like, okay, so Roman Reigns, if he beats Brock Lesnar, he'll be the champion, which I guess theoretically and historically means that he'll be the most pushed guy on television. He'll be in the main event angles. He'll be, the guy headlining all the pay-per-views because he has the world title. But Roman Reigns had already been doing all of that because Lesnar wasn't there all the time. Reigns already was the most pushed guy. Reigns already was the guy in the main events of each pay-per-view. It didn't mean anything to him to really have the title other than just like the historical antidote that he had the title. And I do think that ended up being an impact on the titles and the title's ability to define someone as the most or one of the most important people in the company. I think that a similar, it's very different, but a similar thing took place when Jinder Mahal was just the champion for a few months. And that there was this whole reign where this guy who had no credibility with fans, and after losing the title, continued to have no credibility whatsoever and was pushed back to his preliminary status that he came from. I think that hurt the world title because it didn't I feel like when I was a kid, if you won the world championship, it was maybe it's just because I was a kid, but it felt like it was a justification of someone being an elite wrestler who had achieved something truly momentous in their career. It meant that you were good enough to get this opportunity and that you were going to be in the main event of shows and you were going to be always valued and that anyone that had ever won a championship, had for the most part been protected and pushed even after they lost the title. And with, the Brock Lesnar stuff, and I think especially the Jinder Mahal stuff, it just ended up, it almost doesn't mean anything if you win the title anymore. Maybe within the context of a specific storyline, but I think what really bothers me about the devaluation of the title is that kind of aspect that now it just kind of feels like anyone can win it. And if they win it, it might not be taken that seriously. And I just don't know, that the title equals a certain quality that it used to.
Yeah, I think definitely, like you said, with the United States and Intercontinental titles, those titles have been definitely devalued. And I think as a result, it's probably a bigger thing where the mid card has been devalued. It doesn't really matter if you're a mid card or what does that
Mm-hmm.
even mean anymore? There's no really definitive mid card. I mean, even look at the women's division, like the champions, Asuka, she's a great champion. Bailey or Sasha Banks, these women are main eventers, but everyone else below them, you don't really care about what they're doing, and they are really cool champions. There's a lot of great talent. Selena Vega, she's a great talent, but there was really no chance that she had an opportunity at the title. Even Nikki Cross, she's a great wrestler, but still, they haven't built her up enough to where she could be a feasible world champion. And even the women's tag titles, they've been trying to build that up for ages, but still, it was just kind of a preliminary thing to get the Sasha Bailey thing going. Nothing really much after that. So the main event scene is probably fine for all the divisions, but you go down below that and it's really slim pickings because just of the way they're built, not really just because the talent is there, but the booking isn't there.
And that gets back to our original point, talking about storylines and character development in WWE, which is that a lot of the times these challengers feel like they're coming out of the blue, but that's because they aren't really involved in any storylines or matches, or key matches before they become title challengers.
Yeah.
And WWE will put together an angle for the world title match. And they might put together a title angle for the Intercontinental Championship or something like that. But they won't there's very rarely, unless you're a huge star like Randy Orton or John Cena or someone who's normally in the title picture that is just not in it currently. they're not really going to do a whole lot with you from the mid card. So it does become difficult to elevate someone like Nikki Cross because she just kind of floats around. She did this thing with Alexa, but she's not coming off like a big feud win. Even if she was just feuding with someone like Dana Brooke or, someone kind of disposable that you can like, all right, we're going to have Nikki Cross like in this 4-week feud with Dana Brooke. She's going to pick up a bunch of wins. And when that ends, we can then put her in a title match and we can, fans will feel more ready for her to have that spot because they've seen her kind of been on a hot streak and win a feud. And then now she's got a chance at the title match. That kind of care to storyline isn't a factor in WWE often. So what ends up happening is these people randomly appear and like, yeah, they'll just get a title shot. Like Zelina Vega, whatever. Like, who cares? Like, and I think that, again, that works into the devaluation of the titles because it appears that just literally anyone can get a title shot. And also, I think but it all comes back to WWE not booking storylines and angles on a consistent basis to help get people over, especially if they're not in the world title picture. I don't know how much booking care even goes into like the bottom 60% of the roster.
I even look at some other wrestlers in the women's division, like the Iconics. They broke up the Iconics. Where's that going? We don't know where Billie Kay or Peyton Royce are going.
Hey, I said no one watches main event, but I know for a fact that they had a match on main events, like a singles match. Okay. Peyton Royce won.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but no, you're right. Like,
but even Bianca Belair, she's doing this Mr. Perfect stuff. So how she's the EST of everything. She's the fastest, she's the strongest. But where's this going? Is she going to challenge Asuka eventually? We don't really know where these vignettes are going to go eventually.
With Bianca Belair, would you be shocked if like the vignettes just stopped running and we didn't see her for like 3 months?
No, because that's what happened before when she was with the Street Profits.
Yeah, like that's the kind of thing where condition kind of fans to expect these kind of things, and it's like, okay, like I get the vignettes, they're kind of cool, but I don't have a lot of faith that they're going to eventually translate into being different. I mean, we'll do the Liv Morgan angle is a good one of like they started to do something with her, and then they just stopped. And I know there's a lot of things going on with like Paul Heyman was in charge of the company and then he wasn't. So like, certain that means that certain angles are going to get dropped or anything, but it doesn't change the fact that the impact to the viewer is that like you start something and you just drop it. And sometimes this can work to your advantage. If something's not working, you can just drop it. I thought they should just drop Retribution. Like I just said, like they should just like Retribution should never appear again. And like, just like most of the fan base will forget that it ever happened, in a few months. But I do think that like it does hurt the confidence that people have in WWE when they see stuff being dropped constantly, and that again hurts characters' ability to get over, and it hurts the storylines, and it hurts people's ability to invest in these matches.
Yeah, especially for the talent as well, because even like Liv Morgan, Bianca Belair, the Iconics, these are great talents. These are great wrestlers. They're great characters as well. The Iconics, everyone loved the Iconics. They're devastated when they're broke up, and so there is investment there. It's just that the company investment isn't there, and that's the biggest problem because there's been recent reports that Vince, he's big on Zelina Vega, but he was also big on Aleister Black. And, Aleister Black has these start-stop pushes. And so, Vince likes these guys here and there, likes these guys and girls, but how far that's going to go is anyone's question. It's only up to one guy, and that guy changes his mind all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that ultimately is, I mean, we haven't really got into it on the show, but ultimately, like, Vince is the creative focus for the entire company. Vince is the decision maker. And so any criticism about WWE's creative process comes back to Vince McMahon. And that's, again, not breaking any new ground that we say that Vince, recently does not have the best track record and all of that kind of stuff like that. But it does reason to think that, anytime all of this comes back to Vince, and that if it's, I don't think it's really going to change. That's a big thing with, I think, fans are optimistic that WWE is going to be able to figure this out. They're going to put together storylines that are both, that fans can get invested in. They're going to do this and they're going to do that. And I don't really think that that's probably going to happen while Vince McMahon is still in charge, because I just don't see someone that's been in the position as long as Vince, that's famously as stubborn as Vince, that has a certain kind of mentality about Vince and is just frankly 74 years old, just like, oh, waking up one day and be like, oh, I got to completely change everything, and like, our whole formula is broken, and I got to listen to all these people that are giving me advice, and I need to, we're gonna do this completely different type of booking. I just don't see that like happening. I don't see Vince like waking up one day and coming to that realization. I think he truly thinks what he's doing is the best way to do it, and I would say that it's not, because we have a lot of evidence both from the quality of the product and the various business metrics that suggest that people are losing interest in WWE.
Yeah, included in that is the TV ratings, which is obviously a big deal for WWE. As you said before, it's a television company, and so TV ratings are going to be a big thing. And the fan discourse about TV ratings, it kind of makes it seem like it doesn't matter because people just get into way too much into the details.
Yeah.
But at the same time, do kind of matter because especially you go to the quarter hours, it's just showing like who's piquing the audience's interest. And so it's one of those weird things we'll talk about the TV ratings. Like they don't matter, kind of matter. And even the WWE is a publicly traded company, and so the stocks kind of matter as well about the value of W stock price. But then, as we kind of learned throughout this pandemic, stocks kind of go up and down either way, so that's very volatile as well.
Yeah. So um, one of the things I want to bring up kind of at the end here is I think our next episode might be like a 1 year review of AEW. And one of the things I wanted to point out, at least while we're talking about WWE Creative, is that I think when AEW first started, there was a general belief that they were going to be like a company that was going to produce like amazing wrestling matches that were going to like blow away WWE, because they had so much talent coming in, especially people from, like the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, who had these, legendary matches in Japan. But looking back on AEW 1 year in, what stands out to me is not necessarily like how good the wrestling is. I actually think that comparatively, if you were to compare AEW and WWE/NXT, the in-ring action is pretty close. I don't think there's like a huge gap. What I think we see in AEW, which I did not really anticipate, although it does not surprise me, um, is that like AEW's creative process as far as putting together storylines that work and being able to get over talents that did not have a ton of name value before the company started, has been much better than I think people anticipated. I think that when AEW first started, I didn't think of it as being a company where like they were going to be able to bring in like Ricky Starks or Darby Allin or Orange Cassidy or Jungle Boy and like push them and get them over. I thought it would be like, oh, it's a good place like for like the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega and Cody and Chris Jericho
Sure.
to like, flex their creativity and do that. But I didn't think it would be a promotion that would be like a home for like getting people who were never on television before, who had almost no name value over. But it ended up kind of has been doing that. And it's interesting contrast to WWE, who has really struggled to get their new talent over. And that's obviously indicative in the business that you talked about it earlier, Jason, kind of like how there's been quite a amount of turnover on the WWE roster. Like with the exception of Randy Orton, there's really not a ton of talent that goes back more than 15 years as far as like everyday regular talent. I guess like the Miz is close, and you obviously have people like you'll bring back like MVP,
John
but yeah, John
Morrison.
Morrison. But those guys come and go, and they're not like they haven't just been around forever. There's a lot of turnover. If you were to compare like the WWE roster like today to where it was in like 2010, is a huge change, and that's generally a good thing. We like to see new blood, you like to see new names, but I think it's kind of clear that the new names in WWE haven't really gotten over to the degree that I think WWE needs them to. And I think that you can blame the talent for that, but I think ultimately it's Vince McMahon and the creative team's responsibility to get those people over, and it hasn't really happened. And so I think that ultimately, kind of comparing it to AEW, just that I'm very surprised that AEW has proven to be so efficient at getting talent over when it has been such a struggle for WWE. And what does that say about WWE's creative process in comparison to the creative process of AEW and other wrestling promotions?
Yeah, I think volume is a big factor as well. Like WWE, they're always signing talent. And so you sign new talent, but your current talent aren't being pushed the way they
Yeah, and
should, and then you
Vince
bring in
moves on.
someone new.
Vince moves on to the next toy. Like, right, you said, like, they're pushing this
Right.
person and they just forget about them. And then, we're pushing Lars Sullivan. No, now we're not, now it's
Yeah,
Keith Lee. And
exactly.
like, Vince gives a guy 3 weeks and then all of a sudden, they're
I
back
mean,
to mid card.
even NXT to an extent, Karrion Cross, he comes in, he gets a mega push, and he's kind of just pushing everyone else out of the main event scene. Kind of Keith Lee out of NXT more or less. He beat Keith Lee for the titles, and then he just sort of kicked him out of NXT more or less. And
Only
so with
guy.
AEW,
Oh, with Keith Lee. I mean, Karrion Cross gets hurt. Like, I don't think that that's that big of a problem. Like, they
sure,
want to push. I actually think like you bring in a new guy, give him a monster push. It's unfortunate that he got hurt, but
sure,
I think they need to do that again because, and when it comes to NXT, I mean, not to get too sidetracked, but you had that like fatal four way, and it's Tommaso Ciampa, it's Finn Balor, it's Adam Cole, and it's Johnny Gargano. It's like, okay,
yeah,
these aren't new names in NXT,
that's fair.
these are just the same four guys. We need more names to kind of pop up and do that. So I'm fine with the Karrion Cross thing, but I think to a degree you're correct with the volume of just the kind of churn that goes through WWE, and it's harder for these people who come in from they might get called up to NXT and they get kind of a push and then they just kind of fall back down and then they're just stick on the roster forever. And then as more names just keep coming up and up, and it does become like harder for talent to stand out in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. And also with AEW, like I know there's a lot of fans. It comes from a good place. A lot of fans want AEW to sign this talent or that talent, but to their credit, they've been kind of lenient, at least in the beginning, to signing new talent. Obviously, Starks comes in, Eddie Kingston, Miro, FTR, they come in, but at the same time, they're not getting mega pushes right away. At least using Miro as an example. Miro's sort of starting out in the lower mid card. No offense to Kip
I don't
Sapien,
know
but
what
he's
he's
kind
doing.
of.
I don't know what they're doing with Miro. I mean, I
But
think
at
this.
least with AEW, they've developed a reputation where people are willing to wait and see on Miro on like, oh, maybe they'll do something with him eventually. Because Orange Cassidy, he didn't really do much in the beginning of AEW. He was kind of
Yeah,
just a background guy for Best
they
Friends, and then all
yeah
of a
they
sudden he grows into this main event guy.
yeah he suddenly he's like he was this guy that they would wheel out to like just pop the crowd like it's Orange Cassidy, he's
Mhm.
lazy, and then like flash forward 6 months and he's like getting the Hulk Hogan push. um Yeah, no, I agree that like I think that there comes like when it comes to AEW, and again we'll get into this in our next show because we're
Yeah,
going to
yeah,
talk
yeah.
about AEW more. But I just thought it was an interesting comparison to how like effective they've been able to be, and WWE should be the most effective at this. Not only do they have more experience in a much wider audience, to cater towards and to showcase this talent for, they have so much TV time. Like to me, like I know there was an outbreak of COVID and that thing, and that kind of hurt the NXT card. But like when I was looking at the NXT card, which again I very much liked or the Takeover card, a show I liked,
Yeah.
it was like I was like, there's really no excuse to have so many matches that are just there. You have weekly television. Like, uh, don't there's no reason that the pay-per-view level event should just have like a bunch of random matches that are kind of tossed together in the last like week or so. That becomes like a real kind of like problem for me. And NXT is very reliant on things like having tournaments, having battle royals, having matches to determine number one contenders, which for the most part it makes logical sense because it shows that people have to earn a title shot as opposed to just randomly getting them. But it also kind of oftentimes prevents like a real angle from developing for someone to come for a title, as opposed to like again, while Jey Uso did technically win a number one contenders match, they set up an angle for him to become like to really like become the challenger in for a storyline perspective beyond the fact that he just happened to win a match that made him the number one contender. So I do think that there's part of that as a problem. I don't I don't really want to lump NXT into the broader WWE conversation just because
Sure.
I do think NXT does have like significantly better creative on a week to week basis, and they did do a good job of building up people. Like they did a good job with Cross, they did a good job with Lee, they did a good job with a lot of the talent that they have there, and have had there for years. But I do think that as NXT has become more of a main roster like product, having 2 weeks of television each week, having the week that the television actually like, they're in a ratings war and everything. They have to make sure the television is really, really good, or really, really has a lot of big matches on it. So they can't just kind of like fill it with stuff and go all out on the takeovers. I get all that, but the reason I brought up AEW was just because I do find it kind of interesting that a company with less TV time, with way less brand recognition, with enormously less experience in building stars, has been able to have some success where WWE has not. And I understand that WWE is still more popular than AEW. I understand that more people know who like Dolph Ziggler is than Darby Allin. Like, I understand that it's not like a like-to-like comparison exactly, and that WWE is still a bigger company. But I find from like just from where they were to where they are now, AEW's formula, which is basically consisted of just getting guys on television, allowing them to win, and creating some vignettes and putting them in certain angles, has really helped the company. Like the Darby Allin versus Ricky Starks angle, that's not a match for a title. That's not a match, that just, that's not an angle that's just kind of like taking place the same thing week after week after week after week. They've been going somewhere with it. And I think the result is that it has helped both of those guys get over more. I think it's helped both of their characters. I think it's helped them, in the ring. I think it's been a very successful angle. And that's just a mid-card angle. It's pure mid-card angle. It's not just the main event angle. Because and I don't think there's enough of that in WWE. And when it is, it's kind of like lazy. Like, well, they'll just have a match every single week, and they'll be, the Hurt Business will, screw over, Ricochet and Apollo Crews, and then we'll just do it again next week, and there'll be no real explanation for it. And I think that that's a big difference from like when it comes to getting over new younger talent, the talent that has less name value.
Yeah, you can see the same thing with Rey Mysterio and Seth Rollins. They're no longer feuding for the title. Seth doesn't have isn't fighting for the championship anymore, and so they're both in the mid card. And it seems like they're trying to get Dominic and Buddy Murphy over. I think Dominic kind of is going over to a different thing from Puerto Carrillo, but still, it seems like Buddy Murphy is gonna get a push, maybe for feud of Seth Rollins. But at the same time, this storyline is very convoluted with Aaliyah Mysterio.
It's another problem of Angle becoming too complex for its own good. You know what was a simple angle? Obviously, I hate the eye for an eye match. I don't even want to talk about that. But you know what was a very simple angle, though, as bad as the eye for an eye match was Dominic Mysterio wanted revenge on Seth for taking out his dad. And Dominic hadn't wrestled a match before, and he was going against a guy who was very accomplished in Seth Rollins. But they ended up having a very good match that I felt invested in, because I'm like, I want to see how this young guy does against Seth, and I want to see like how well he does, trying to get revenge for his father. That was a very simple angle, and that match really worked. Now you get into this whole love triangle, and like Murphy's like not call it. It's like like he's like he's like a brainwashed cult member of Seth, and you bring in Aaliyah, and now like the whole Mysterio family is on TV every single week, and like that's. Again, you took what was a simple and effective storyline to, for me, has been a much more complex and eye-roll inducing storyline.
Yeah, at the same time, WWE, you don't really know where it's going, and you don't have any confidence that it's going to end very well for Buddy Murphy. It seems like it could be a vehicle to promote Seth again, because it seems like WWE is really into Seth Rollins.
Murphy's just a guy. Like, he just happens to be in that role. Like, I don't think like he's a good wrestler, and there's an argument that there's certainly an argument that they could be doing something there, and that there's plenty of worse people they could put into the role that he's in currently. But to me, like, that's just like a I don't think like he's like really going to get anything out of this. I think Dominic, maybe, just because I think part of the condition of Rey Mysterio being in WWE right now and re-signing with them is because he wants to kind of help Dominic's career get off the ground. And so I think that there's going to be more people advocating for Dominic than there are for Murphy. But I don't see him going anywhere.
No, I doubt it either. Maybe, I mean, I guess it's what you said before. You're just kind of hoping for a good match. And so Seth and Buddy really like each other. And so it'll probably be a good match, but I don't really care what happens next unless something crazy, some other crazy thing happens. I don't know if like a cousin comes in from the Mysterio family. Maybe more Mysterios come in. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I didn't know Ray had like this sprawl. I guess I did because they had appeared before, but it does say something that like Ray was negotiating with WWE, and he didn't. I guess he didn't have a contract at the time, and so then he resigns, and then all of a sudden, not only is Dominic getting a push, like his entire family is on television all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a coincidence that Ray was negotiating his contract, and then all of a sudden he signs, and suddenly like his daughter's getting a ton of TV time. Like, I mean, I'm not gonna knock Rey Mysterio's daughter, but if
No.
you're like a woman, if you're like a woman in NXT, or even a woman who's on the main roster, and you've been, busting your ass for years and years to try to get something going for you on TV, and they come up with like a role for somebody to be on TV each week, and it goes to Rey Mysterio's daughter, who's never appeared on television before. Um, I don't know. That's kind of sting. Okay, that's kind of it. I think we're gonna wrap it up for today. Again, I appreciate everyone who's listening to this. We might tinker with the format going forward. This is still very much a work in progress, but again, we appreciate everyone who is listening. Yeah, I'll put our Twitter names in the description for this, so if people want to follow us both on social media. Jason, do you have anything you want to plug?
No, yeah, just follow me on Twitter. Sometimes tweet about wrestling, sometimes tweet about K-pop or whatever news is going on. That's really all. You'll get it there. Don't forget to follow our Twitter as well, and the podcast Twitter as well.
Yep.
That's a really big help for us as well.
Yep, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're listening to this on YouTube, or if you're listening to it on SoundCloud, or however anyone else is listening to this. We look forward to hearing back from you, and if you guys have any comments, please feel free, reach out to us on Twitter, reach out to us on YouTube, leave a comment in the section. We'd love to hear from anyone who's listening. And thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you guys later next time.
All right, peace.